The mop hit the floor. "Want to spar for fun, boy?" The billionaire's racist sneer froze when David's eyes flashed deadly. What happened next destroyed a 28-year mystery. The black man he'd been tormenting wasn't who anyone thought. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button for more. Also, share your thoughts, and let me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, so don't miss out. Now, let's continue. The floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Tower's penthouse groaned under the weight of James Sterling's massive fists as he pressed them against reinforced glass, staring down at a city that trembled beneath his empire like frightened prey. At 48, he stood 6 feet 4 inches and carried 240 pounds of pure, concentrated menace, shoulders broad enough to eclipse doorways, arms thick as tree trunks from decades of turning rage into devastating physical power. His face was a masterpiece of intimidation. A square jaw that looked like it could shatter concrete, steel-gray eyes cold as Arctic death, a twice-broken nose that resembled a weapon more than a feature. Deep scars decorated his knuckles like battle medals, each one a reminder of someone who'd learned, the hard way, why crossing James Sterling was the last mistake they'd ever make. But tonight, something darker than usual twisted in his gut. A restless, predatory energy that made his skin crawl with anticipation he couldn't name. The crystal tumbler looked like a child's toy in his massive hands as he downed bourbon that would put lesser men on the floor. "Sir." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, carefully modulated to avoid triggering the legendary Sterling temper that had hospitalized 3 men in the past year alone. "Your car is ready. The Apex Combat Club is expecting you." James straightened to his full terrifying height, his presence filling the $60 million penthouse like gathering storm clouds. The exclusive underground fight club was where he went to remind the world, and himself, that money wasn't his deadliest weapon. His reputation there was whispered about in fearful tones. The billionaire beast who fought like he was trying to murder his own demons, who'd never met an opponent he couldn't break both physically and mentally before the first bell rang. Other members had learned to give him wide berth, especially after what he'd done to that hedge fund prince who dared question his methods. James didn't just win fights, he destroyed souls, left grown men whimpering for mercy that never came. But lately, even breaking bones and crushing spirits hadn't been enough to satisfy the hunger gnawing at his chest. He needed something more personal, more intimate. Someone who couldn't fight back, couldn't afford lawyers, couldn't do anything but take whatever punishment James decided to dish out. Someone like that uppity janitor who'd been testing his patience for months. The penthouse elevator descended like a steel cage carrying an apex predator toward fresh prey, while James's lips twisted into a smile that would have made serial killers nervous. 20 blocks south, in the basement service corridors of the Apex Combat Club, David Washington moved through his cleaning routine with movements that somehow managed to be both humble and graceful, a contradiction that had been irritating certain people for longer than was healthy. He 28. His 6 feet 2 inches frame carried 210 pounds of lean, dangerous muscle hidden beneath work clothes that couldn't quite disguise the predatory athleticism coiled underneath. His rich, dark skin gleamed under harsh fluorescent lighting, highlighting features that commanded attention despite his desperate efforts to remain invisible. High cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, a strong jaw that spoke of stubborn pride he'd learned to bury, and dark brown eyes that burned with intelligence most people never bothered to notice. Everything about David's build suggested explosive power held carefully in check. Broad shoulders that filled doorways, arms corded with muscle. That came from real work layered over something far more expensive, hands that moved with unconscious precision that spoke of training worth more than most people's houses. But David Washington had learned, through bitter experience, that being a large athletic black man in spaces owned by powerful white men was dangerous territory. Better to fold that impressive frame into corners, to make himself smaller, invisible, forgettable. Survival had taught him that his strength was a liability, something to be hidden, never revealed, because men like his employers saw black excellence as a threat to be eliminated. The sounds from the training floors above made his jaw clench with barely controlled longing. The sharp crack of perfect technique meeting immovable defense, elite fighters testing themselves against worthy opponents, voices calling out corrections and languages that whispered of private coaches and unlimited resources. David had been forced to bury skills that belonged to a different lifetime. Techniques that cost fortunes to learn, muscle memory that sang with the echoes of training he'd paid for with more than money. His current identity was survival crafted into art. David Washington, night janitor, invisible man who cleaned up after his betters and never, ever complained about the scraps of dignity they threw him. For 18 months, he'd perfected the performance. Head down, voice quiet, movements efficient but unremarkable. He'd become a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had no use for men like him except as furniture that occasionally needed replacing. But there was one man who seemed determined to make David's invisibility impossible. The memory of this morning's encounter made his hands tighten around the mop handle until his knuckles went white. James Sterling, standing in the marble lobby like a monument to barely controlled violence, had looked David up and down with those dead, arctic eyes and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Make sure you get the floors extra clean today, boy. Wouldn't want anyone slipping on whatever filth you people track in." The racial slur had hit like a physical blow, but David had swallowed his pride, nodded respectfully, and continued his work while Sterling's laughter echoed through the lobby like breaking glass. Because fighting back wasn't an option for a man with secrets worth killing for. Because invisible men didn't get to have pride. Because sometimes survival meant swallowing poison and pretending it tasted like medicine. But lately, the poison was getting harder to swallow. Sterling's casual cruelty had been escalating, louder insults, more public humiliation, deliberate attempts to provoke a reaction that would give the billionaire an excuse for violence that went far beyond words. Have you ever had to stay silent while someone publicly disrespected you? How long do you think someone can endure that kind of treatment before they snap? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tonight felt different. Charged. Like something that had been building pressure for months was finally ready to explode. David pushed his industrial cart through the service elevator, his powerful frame tense with anticipation he couldn't name. The VIP floor was Sterling's domain, his private kingdom where Manhattan's most dangerous men gathered to play warrior in $1,000 gear while pretending their money could buy them genuine respect. The elevator doors opened to reveal luxury designed to intimidate, Italian marble floors that cost more per square foot than David made in 3 months. Crystal chandeliers throwing rainbow patterns across walls lined with photographs of champions who'd never known real hunger, real fear, real desperation. But David's attention was immediately captured by the main training area, where a mountain of a man moved through martial arts forms with precision that made the air itself seem dangerous. Even from behind, James Sterling's presence was overwhelming, a broad back straining against custom training gear, movements that spoke of violence perfected over decades of turning other men's pain into personal pleasure. The billionaire turned, and David felt his world shift into slow motion, Sterling's steel-gray eyes locked onto David's darker ones across the training mats, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. The massive white man's scarred face twisted into the kind of smile that made grown men check for exits and pray their wills were up to date. Well, 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 Sterling's voice rumbled like distant thunder carrying promises of destruction. Look what the night shift dragged in. James studied the young black man with the calculating gaze of a predator who'd found prey that might actually be worth the effort of killing slowly. Something about the janitor's presence, the way he stood straight-backed despite months of deliberate humiliation, the intelligence that blazed behind carefully controlled eyes, triggered every sadistic instinct the billionaire possessed. Tonight, James decided, looking at David like a problem that needed permanent solving, was going to be very educational. "Sir," David replied carefully, his deep voice steady despite the danger radiating from Sterling's massive frame like heat from a furnace. "I need to clean the training area." The respectful tone did nothing to soften the billionaire's predatory expression. If anything, it seemed to fuel his appetite for cruelty. The way this janitor refused to cower properly, met his gaze instead of looking away, spoke with quiet dignity that needed to be crushed into appropriate submission. "Do you now?" James stepped closer, using his size advantage like a weapon, his voice dripping with racial contempt that made the air thick with menace. "Tell me something, boy, you ever seen real fighting before? Or do you just shuffle around cleaning up after real men while dreaming about being something more than the help?" The words hit David like physical blows, each syllable calculated to wound, to diminish, to remind him exactly what James Sterling thought of men who looked like him. But David's expression remained carefully neutral, years of survival having taught him to let insults slide off like water on stone. "I just cleaned, sir," David said quietly, but something in his voice, a carefully controlled undercurrent that spoke of depths Sterling couldn't fathom, made the billionaire's eyes narrow with dangerous interest. "Just clean," James repeated mockingly, beginning to circle David like a shark that had scented blood in the water. How appropriate. How perfectly fitting. His smile turned genuinely cruel, the expression of a man who'd found entertainment that might actually satisfy his particular appetites. The massive billionaire stopped directly in front of David, close enough that the younger man could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath, could see the anticipation of violence building in those cold, dead eyes. "You know what, boy?" James's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow managed to be more threatening than shouting. "I'm feeling generous tonight. Educational, even. How about you put down that mop and step onto these mats with me? Consider it community outreach." The invitation was loaded with malice so pure it was almost artistic in its cruelty. James expected the janitor to stammer excuses, to back down, to remember his place in the careful hierarchy that kept men like Sterling on top and men like David firmly beneath their heels. Instead, David set down his cleaning supplies with deliberate care, his movements carrying a grace that made the billionaire pause. When the younger man straightened to his full, impressive height, the size difference between them was less dramatic than Sterling had expected, and somehow, that felt like the first small crack in a foundation the billionaire had thought was unshakable. "Just for fun?" David asked quietly, but his voice carried something that made Sterling's predatory smile falter for just an instant. "Oh yes," James growled, rolling massive shoulders that looked capable of breaking smaller men in half. "This is going to be very enlightening. For both of us." Neither man realized they were about to step onto mats that would strip away every assumption, every prejudice, every carefully constructed lie they'd built their separate worlds upon. The revelation coming would shatter more than bones. It would destroy everything they thought they knew about strength, about worth, about the true measure of a man's character. And when the impossible truth finally emerged, it would leave everyone who witnessed it completely, utterly, devastatingly speechless. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the performance about to unfold would rewrite both their lives in ways that would haunt them forever. James Sterling thought he was about to teach a lesson, had no idea he was about to learn one that would change everything. Overwhelming force. His first punch, a devastating right hook that could have shattered concrete, whistled through the air where David's head had been a split second before. David wasn't there anymore. He'd moved like liquid lightning, flowing around James's attack with impossible grace. The counterstrike came so fast that most of the watching crowd missed it entirely, a precise jab that connected with James's solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The billionaire staggered backward, his eyes widening with a first flicker of something that might have been concern. That had hurt. More than it should have. Much more than any janitor's punch had a right to. "Lucky shot," James snarled, but his voice carried less confidence than before. He charged again, this time throwing a combination that had hospitalized 3 men in the past month alone. Left hook, right. Cross uppercut, each strike carrying enough power to break bones, delivered with the precision of expensive training and natural brutality. David moved through the assault like he was dancing. Every punch missed by inches. Every kick found empty air. The young man flowed around James's attacks with a fluidity that defied physics, his movements so perfectly controlled that he seemed to be existing in a different timeline than everyone else in the room. And then David struck back. The combination was poetry written in violence. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut, each technique flowing seamlessly into the next with a precision that spoke of training worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Elite instruction. Private coaches. The kind of martial arts education that billionaires bought for their most precious possessions. Every strike found its target with surgical accuracy. James's head snapped back from the jab. His body doubled over from the cross, His legs nearly buckled from the hook, and the uppercut lifted him clean off his feet. The massive billionaire hit the mats hard, his intimidating frame suddenly looking vulnerable and mortal. Blood trickled from his nose, and for the first time in years, James Sterling experienced something he'd almost forgotten existed: genuine fear. The crowd had gone dead silent. Phones hung forgotten in slack hands as Manhattan's elite stared at something that shouldn't have been possible. The janitor, the invisible, humble janitor they'd all ignored, was systematically dismantling the most feared fighter in their exclusive circle. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "Where did he learn to fight like that?" David's breathing was perfectly controlled, his stance relaxed but ready. He looked down at James with eyes that held no hatred, no triumph, just the quiet confidence of a man who'd finally stopped pretending to be less than he was. "My turn," David said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made grown billionaires step backward involuntarily. James struggled to his feet, his massive frame shaking with rage and something uncomfortably close to panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. The janitor was supposed to be helpless, broken, begging for mercy. Instead, he stood there like someone who belonged in this world. Someone who'd been trained by the best, who carried himself with the unconscious arrogance that came from never doubting your place at the top of the food chain. "You son of a bitch," James snarled, wiping blood from his split lip. "I don't know what game you're playing," but he never finished the sentence. David moved like lightning made flesh, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. This time, there was no holding back, no careful control. The combination that followed was a masterclass in precision violence. 12 strikes in 3 seconds, each one placed with the accuracy of a surgeon and the power of a sledgehammer. James Sterling, the man who'd built an empire on intimidation and violence, crumpled to the mats like a discarded suit of armor. His massive frame, which had terrorized opponents for decades, suddenly looked fragile and defeated. The crowd erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shocked disbelief, phones appeared as people tried to capture what they'd just witnessed, and several members began placing frantic calls to private investigators, desperate to find out who David Washington really was. But David himself seemed oblivious to the pandemonium he'd created. He knelt beside James's fallen form, his expression shifting from warrior to something almost compassionate. "You all right?" he asked quietly, offering James a hand up with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained through 18 months of abuse. James stared at the offered hand like it was a poisonous snake. This man, this janitor, had just humiliated him in front of Manhattan's most powerful people. Had exposed him as weak, vulnerable, human. And now he was offering help with the same calm respect he'd shown while being systematically tormented. Can you imagine being completely wrong about someone's abilities? What do you think just went through James's mind seeing David's true skills? Drop your thoughts below. Who are you? James whispered, his voice hoarse with shock, and something that might have been awed David's hand remained extended, steady and patient. "I'm just the janitor, Mr. Sterling. The same person I was 10 minutes ago." But they both knew that was a lie. The man standing over James Sterling wasn't a janitor. He was something else entirely. Something that belonged in a world of private training and unlimited resources. Something that moved with the unconscious grace of someone who'd never known real want, real fear, real desperation. Something that raised questions neither man was ready to answer. As James finally accepted the offered hand and was pulled to his feet, he found himself staring into David's dark eyes with a mixture of rage, confusion, and something uncomfortably close to respect. The janitor had just shattered every assumption James had made about strength, about worth, about the natural order of things. And in the stunned silence that followed, as Manhattan's elite tried to process what they'd witnessed, both men stood facing each other across a divide that had just become infinitely more complex. The audience had gotten their show. They'd witnessed something that would be talked about in whispered conversations for months to come. They'd seen the impossible happen. And just as the hook had promised, they were completely, utterly, devastatingly speechless. But the real revelations were still to come. Because the man who just destroyed James Sterling in combat was carrying secrets that would make his fighting skills seem trivial by comparison. And when those secrets finally came to light, the word speechless wouldn't even begin to cover what everyone would feel. Putting that particular demon back in its cage. David. The voice belonged to Marcus Chun, one of the few decent human beings among the club's elite membership. The tech entrepreneur approached with genuine concern. That was incredible. Where did you learn to fight like that? David's hands tightened around the mop handle. Here it came, the questions he'd spent years learning to deflect. Just picked things up here and there, Mr. Chun. Here and there. Marcus's voice carried skeptical amusement. David, I've been training for 15 years with some of the best instructors money can buy. What you just did, that wasn't picking things up. That was mastery. The word hit David like a physical blow. Mastery. It had been so long since anyone had recognized his skills for what they truly were, had seen past the carefully constructed facade of mediocrity he'd built around himself like armor. My mother. David began, then stopped himself. Talking about Rebecca was dangerous territory, a path that led to questions he couldn't answer without unraveling 20 years of carefully constructed lies. Your mother what? David's dark eyes flickered with something that might have been pain. She always said I was good with my hands. Said it ran in the family. It wasn't technically a lie. Rebecca had said that, usually while watching 8-year-old David practice forms in their backyard, tears streaming down her beautiful face as she remembered someone else who'd moved with the same unconscious grace. She used to tell me stories, David continued quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them, about wealthy men who thought they owned the world. Said they'd destroy anyone who got in their way, especially people like us. Marcus frowned. People like you? Black people who forgot their place. David's voice carried 20 years of buried anger. She said the rich ones were the worst. Said they'd smile to your face while planning your destruction, then act surprised when you ended up dead or disappeared. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Marcus visibly uncomfortable. David, that's a pretty dark worldview. Is it? David's eyes flicked toward the VIP lounge where James Sterling sat plotting his next move. Look around, Mr. Chun. You think any of these men would hesitate to destroy me if they thought I was a threat to their comfortable little world? Before Marcus could answer, James Sterling's voice cut through the air like a blade. Washington. The command echoed through the training floor, causing every conversation to stop mid-sentence. David turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral despite the danger signals screaming in his head. James had risen from his table and stood at the edge of the VIP area like a general surveying a battlefield. His massive frame radiated barely controlled violence, but there was something else in his steel-gray eyes, a calculating intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier rage. Come here, James ordered, his voice carrying the tone of a man who'd never been disobeyed. David set down his mop with deliberate care and walked toward the billionaire, his movements fluid and controlled. The other club members watched in fascination, sensing that they were about to witness the second act of whatever drama had begun on the training mats. Sir. David's voice was respectfully neutral, but his eyes held depths that James was only beginning to recognize. I want to know where you learned to fight, James said without preamble. And don't give me any bullshit about picking things up here and there. That was professional-level training. Elite instruction. The kind that costs serious money. David's expression didn't change. I told Mr. Chun, my mother always said I was good with my hands. Your mother. James's voice carried dangerous interest. Tell me about her. Something flickered behind David's careful mask. Pain, anger, protective instinct. She's dead. When? 5 years ago. How? David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Cancer. Couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved her. The words hit James with unexpected force. He'd been expecting defiance, evasion, perhaps anger. Instead, He got raw honesty that carried the weight of genuine grief. What was her name? David hesitated for a fraction of a second, so briefly that only someone with James's predatory instincts would have noticed. Rebecca. Rebecca Washington. The name sent a jolt through James's system that he couldn't explain. Rebecca. Why did that sound familiar? Like an echo from a dream he couldn't quite remember? She raised you alone. Yes, sir. What about your father? David's entire body went rigid, and for a moment, James caught a glimpse of something volcanic burning behind those carefully controlled eyes. She told me he was a wealthy white man who decided his money was more important than his family, David said quietly, each word carrying the weight of 20 years of abandonment and rage. Said he threw us away like garbage when it became inconvenient to love us. The words hit James like physical blows, not because of their cruelty, but because of their specificity. The pain in David's voice was too real, too precise to be fabricated. This young man carried genuine wounds, the kind that came from being discarded by someone who should have protected him. She ever tell you his name? James asked, his voice strangely hoarse. David's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. Does it matter? Rich white men who abandon their black families aren't exactly unique, Mr. Sterling. They're practically a cottage industry. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to carry the weight of abandonment your whole life? What do you think David's mother Rebecca was really trying to protect him from? Share your thoughts below. The accusation hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. James felt something twist in his chest, recognition mixed with a horror he couldn't name. The way David spoke about abandonment, about wealthy white men who destroyed black families, carried the ring of personal experience that made James's mouth go dry. You think that's what I am? James asked quietly. A rich white man who destroys families. David's dark eyes met James's steel-gray ones without flinching. I think you're a man who's used to getting what he wants, when he wants it, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. And I think if my mother were still alive, she'd tell me to stay as far away from you as possible. And yet here you are. Here I am, David agreed, his voice carrying undertones James couldn't decipher. Cleaning up your messes. Just like she always said I'd end up doing. James stared at the young man standing before him, trying to reconcile the humble janitor with the warrior who'd humiliated him, trying to understand why David's pain felt so familiar, so personal. Rebecca Washington. Why did that name keep echoing in his mind like a half-remembered song? And why did looking into David's eyes feel like staring into a mirror that reflected his own soul back at him, distorted by 20 years of guilt and longing he couldn't explain? Get back to work, James said finally, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. David nodded respectfully and returned to his cleaning duties, but both men knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained was cracking, revealing depths that neither was prepared to explore. James watched David move across the training floor with that impossible grace. Questions multiplied in his mind like cancer cells. Who was this man really? What was he hiding? And why did every instinct James possessed scream that David Washington was connected to something in his past, something important enough to change everything? The obsession was taking root, growing stronger with each passing moment. And neither man realized that they were standing on the precipice of revelations that would shatter both their worlds completely. The resistance was crumbling. The questions were multiplying. And the truth, when it finally emerged, would leave everyone who heard it completely, utterly, devastatingly speechless. Level with the cleaning man. I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About wealthy white men who abandon their families. Have you? Oh yes. Very specific accusation. Very personal. James leaned forward, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. Made me wonder what kind of man could abandon a woman like Rebecca Washington. David's hand stopped moving for the briefest instant, so quick that only someone with James's predatory instincts would have caught it. But it was there, recognition, pain, something deeper than casual conversation should have triggered. You didn't know her, David said quietly. Didn't I? James's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Rebecca Washington. Beautiful name. Elegant. The kind of name that sticks with you, even when you think you've forgotten everything else. This time David did stop cleaning, his dark eyes lifting to meet James's steel-gray ones with an intensity that made the air between them crackle with electricity. What are you saying? I'm saying, James replied slowly, that some names have a way of echoing through a man's life. Some faces haunt your dreams even when you can't remember why they matter. The words hung between them like a loaded gun. David straightened to his full height, his powerful frame suddenly radiating the same dangerous energy that had overwhelmed James on the training mats. My mother never mentioned knowing any billionaires, David said carefully, but his voice carried undertones that suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that fact. Maybe she had her reasons. Such as... James studied David's face with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that would either save or destroy him. Maybe she was protecting someone. Maybe she was protecting you. From what? From men like me. The admission hung in the air like a confession, raw and unexpected. David blinked, clearly not having anticipated such honesty from someone he'd pegged as pure predator. Why would she need to protect me from you specifically? David asked, his voice barely audible. James was quiet for a long moment, his massive hands clenched into fists on his knees. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that spoke of old wounds never properly healed. 21 years ago, I was a different man. Younger. More reckless. I thought money could buy anything, solve any problem, make any complication disappear. And I was involved with a woman. James's voice grew softer, more vulnerable. Beautiful woman. Brilliant. Strong. She worked in my building, not for me, but for one of the companies I'd invested in. David had gone perfectly still, his cleaning supplies forgotten as he listened to words that felt like they were reshaping the universe around him. What happened to her? She disappeared. The words came out harsh, brutal. One day she was there, the next she was gone. Like she'd never existed at all. Maybe she had good reasons for leaving. Maybe. James looked up at David with eyes that held depths of pain the younger man hadn't expected. Or maybe I was such a bastard that she felt she had no choice. The honesty was like a physical blow. David had spent 20 years hating a man he'd never met, carrying rage toward someone his mother had painted as a monster. But the pain in James Sterling's voice suggested a more complicated story. Did you? David's voice cracked slightly. Did you love her? The question hit James like lightning, illuminating corners of his soul he tried to keep dark. More than I've ever loved anything before or since. Then why didn't you find her? Who says I didn't try? James's laugh was bitter, self-loathing. I hired the best investigators money could buy. Traced every lead. Followed every hint. It was like she'd vanished into thin air taking... He stopped himself, the words dying on his lips. Taking what? David pressed, his voice intense with an urgency he couldn't explain. James stared at him for a long moment, something flickering behind his steel-gray eyes that looked dangerously close to recognition. James finished quietly. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications neither man was ready to face. David found himself studying James's features with new eyes, the strong jawline, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he wasn't being deliberately intimidating, the shape of his hands when they weren't clenched into weapons. What was her last name? David asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Williams, James replied automatically. Rebecca Williams. The name hit David like a physical blow. His mother had been Rebecca Washington for as long as he could remember, but before that, had there been another name? Another life she'd never talked about. You look like you've seen a ghost, James observed, his predatory instincts picking up on David's reaction. Maybe I have. David's voice was hollow, distant. My mother. She never talked about her life before I was born. Said it didn't matter, that we were starting fresh. Starting fresh from what? I don't know. I always assumed it was just poverty. Bad circumstances. She said wealthy men had destroyed her family once, and she wouldn't let it happen again. James leaned forward, his massive frame tense with sudden, desperate hope. What did she look like? David's breath caught in his throat. This was dangerous territory, questions that led toward revelations he wasn't sure he was ready for. Beautiful, he said finally. High cheekbones, dark skin that looked like burnished copper in the sunlight. Elegant hands. She moved like she'd been trained to be graceful. Each word hit James like a bullet. The description matched perfectly, down to details that couldn't be coincidence. Did she have a scar? James asked urgently. Small one, just above her left eyebrow? David went white. How do you know about that? Because I kissed it goodbye the last time I saw her. The admission exploded between them like a grenade, shattering the careful distance they'd maintained. David staggered backward, his powerful frame suddenly looking vulnerable and young. That's impossible. Is it? James rose from his chair, towering over David, but somehow managing to look desperate rather than intimidating. What if your mother had reasons for changing her name? What if she was running from something or someone, and took you with her? No. David shook his head violently. No, you're lying. She told me my father abandoned us. Chose his empire over his family. What if she lied to protect you? Protect me from what? James's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more impact than shouting. From me. From my world. From enemies who would have used you to destroy everything I'd built. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of separation and lies. David stared at James with eyes that held equal parts horror and desperate hope. You're suggesting. David's voice failed him. I'm suggesting that maybe Rebecca Williams became Rebecca Washington for the same reason she took her son and disappeared into the night. Maybe she thought she was saving him from a war he never asked to be part of. The emergency lighting flickered, casting their shadows across the walls like ghosts dancing at the edges of revelation. For hours had become an eternity, time enough for careful constructions to crumble and impossible truths to take their place. If what you're saying is true, David whispered, his voice breaking on the words, then everything I believed about my life is a lie. Not a lie, James corrected gently. A mother's love. The most desperate, protective kind. They stood facing each other in the amber glow, two men on the precipice of a recognition that would change everything. The truth was building between them like pressure in a fault line, ready to reshape the landscape of their lives with seismic force. And in the silence that followed, both men realized that they were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were something far more dangerous, far more impossible. They were family recognizing itself across 20 years of separation and lies. The revelation was coming. And when it hit, it would leave everyone who witnessed it completely, utterly, devastatingly speechless. The amber emergency lighting flickered again, casting dancing shadows across James Sterling's face as he stared at David with eyes that held 21 years of desperate searching. The silence between them had grown heavy with implications, pregnant with truths that threatened to reshape everything they thought they knew about their lives. There's something else, James said quietly, his massive frame suddenly looking fragile in the dim light. Something I haven't told anyone. Not my lawyers, not my investigators. Not even myself, most days. David's dark eyes tracked every micro-expression on James's face, searching for lies but finding only raw, unguarded pain. What? James pulled out his phone with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, navigating to a hidden folder buried deep in his photo gallery. The screen illuminated his scarred features as he hesitated, thumb hovering over an image he hadn't looked at in months. This, he said finally, turning the phone toward David. The photograph was old, slightly grainy, clearly taken with a cheaper camera from over 2 decades ago. But the image it captured was breathtaking. A young woman with copper-dark skin and elegant features, laughing at something off-camera while sunlight caught the gold highlights in her hair. She wore a simple white dress that somehow managed to look expensive, and her hand rested protectively over a small but unmistakable curve in her belly. David's breath caught in his throat. The resemblance to the woman who'd raised him was unmistakable, but this version of Rebecca was different. Younger, carefree, glowing with a happiness he'd never seen in his mother's face during his childhood. She was pregnant, David whispered. 6 months, James confirmed, his voice breaking slightly. She was radiant. I'd never seen anyone more beautiful in my life. When was this taken? 3 weeks before she disappeared. James's thumb traced the edge of the phone screen like he was caressing the woman's face. I was going to propose that night. Had the ring, the whole speech planned. I was finally ready to make it official, to claim her publicly as mine. The words hit David like physical blows. His entire worldview, built on his mother's stories of abandonment and betrayal, was cracking apart like ice in spring. What happened? James was quiet for a long moment, his steel-gray eyes distant as memory pulled him back to a night that had haunted him for over 20 years. The Sterling Industries boardroom was a battlefield dressed in mahogany and marble, where 26-year-old James Sterling faced down the vultures who called themselves his business partners. His empire was young but growing rapidly, making enemies faster than allies. "The problem, James," sneered Malcolm Ashford, oil baron and old money aristocrat, "is that you're getting distracted. Your performance has been unfocused lately." James's younger self radiated the same dangerous energy, but tempered with an idealism that would later be burned away by loss. "My performance has tripled our quarterly profits." "And your personal life?" The question hung in the air like a threat. James's jaw tightened. "My personal life is none of your concern." "Isn't it?" Ashford smiled like a predator scenting weakness. "Word is you've been seen around town with someone. Inappropriate. Someone who doesn't quite fit the image we're cultivating." "Careful, Malcolm." "A black woman, James. Beautiful, I'm told, but hardly suitable for someone in your position." Ashford leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more poison than shouting. "The investors are getting nervous. Wondering if you're the kind of leader who makes emotional decisions." James had risen from his chair like a force of nature, his presence filling the room with barely controlled violence. "If you ever speak about Rebecca that way again, Rebecca Williams." Another board member, Patricia Hawthorne, pharmaceutical heiress, pulled out a manila folder thick with photographs and documents. Age 24. Works for Meridian Consulting on the 17th floor. No family money, no connections, no value to our organization except as a distraction. James stared at the surveillance photos. Rebecca entering her apartment building, Rebecca at the grocery store, Rebecca waiting for him at their favorite restaurant. They'd been watching her, cataloging her movements like she was a threat to be neutralized. "You had her followed." "We had you followed," Patricia corrected. Coldly. "She just happened to be in most of the pictures." "This ends now." "Does it?" Malcolm's smile turned genuinely cruel. "Because we've discovered some interesting things about Miss Williams. Did you know she has a sealed juvenile record? Arrests for theft, assault. Her mother was addicted to crack, her father unknown. She grew up in housing projects that would make your trust fund friends faint." Each word was designed to wound, to make James see Rebecca as damaged goods instead of the brilliant strong woman he'd fallen in love with. But instead of shame, he felt rage building in his chest like molten steel. None of that matters. Doesn't it? What happens when the media finds out? What happens when our investors realize their golden boy is slumming with ghetto trash who's probably only with him for the money? James had moved so fast that Malcolm barely had time to flinch before finding himself pressed against the boardroom windows 50 floors above the street, James's hands wrapped around his throat. "Say another word about her, and I'll throw you through this glass." "James." Patricia's voice cut through his rage like ice water. "Let him go. Please." He'd released Malcolm, who crumpled to the floor gasping and clutching his throat. But the damage was done. The lines were drawn. "Here's what's going to happen," Patricia continued with the calm of someone who'd planned this moment carefully. "You're going to end this relationship. Quietly. Cleanly. Miss Williams will receive a generous severance package and a recommendation for employment elsewhere. Far elsewhere. And if I refuse, then we destroy her." The words were spoken with such casual certainty that they carried more impact than threats. Public humiliation. Criminal charges that suddenly become unsealed. Tax investigations that reveal irregularities in her employment. She'll be unemployable, unhouseable, unlovable to anyone who matters. James stared at the faces around the boardroom table, people he'd thought were allies, friends, family. Instead, he saw predators who viewed Rebecca as nothing more than an obstacle to their profits. "You're giving me an ultimatum." "We're giving you a choice," Malcolm wheezed from the floor. "Her life, or your empire. Choose wisely." James had walked out of that meeting with his world tilting on its axis, knowing that everything he'd built was being used as a weapon against the woman he loved. The ring box in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I went to her that night," James continued in the present, his voice hollow with remembered pain. "Told her everything. The threats, the ultimatum, the choice I was being forced to make." David was gripping the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles had gone white. "What did she say?" "She cried." James's voice broke completely. "God, she cried like her heart was breaking. Then she looked at me with those beautiful eyes and said the words that destroyed my life, 'I understand.' She understood. She understood that she was pregnant with my child, and my business partners were prepared to destroy her to get to me. She understood that loving me had made her a target. She understood that staying would put our baby in danger." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 21 years of separation and lies. David felt something inside his chest cracking open, not breaking but expanding, making room for truths too large for the space they'd been given. "She left to protect your child," David whispered. "She left to protect our child," James corrected, his steel-gray eyes boring into David's darker ones with desperate intensity. "She kissed me goodbye, told me she loved me more than life itself, and disappeared into the night with my heart and my future growing inside her. But you searched for her. I tore my empire apart searching for her." James's voice carried 21 years of obsessive desperation. Hired investigators, private security firms, called in favors from people who owed me their lives. Nothing. It was like Rebecca Williams had never existed. Because she became Rebecca Washington. Because she was smarter than all of us. James's laugh was bitter, self-loathing. She knew exactly how to disappear, how to create a new identity, how to protect what mattered most. David stared at the photograph still glowing on James's phone screen, seeing his mother as he'd never known her, young in love, carrying a child she would spend the rest of her life protecting from the man who'd fathered him. "The baby," David said quietly, his voice barely audible. "What happened to the baby?" James looked up at him with eyes that held depths of pain and hope and desperate, impossible recognition. "I don't know," James whispered. "I've spent 21 years wondering if I had a son or daughter out there somewhere. Wondering if they were safe, if they were loved, if they knew their father never stopped looking for them." The silence that followed was deafening. Two men stared at each other across the amber-lit space, both beginning to understand that they weren't strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were the two halves of Rebecca Williams' heart, the man she'd loved and the child she'd protected, finally finding each other after 21 years of separation orchestrated by her desperate sacrificial love. "David," James said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition that was becoming impossible to deny. How old are you? David's voice came out as barely a whisper. 28. The math was perfect. Devastating. Impossible to ignore. 21 years since Rebecca disappeared, plus 9 months of pregnancy, minus the time that had passed since David's birth. The truth was building between them like pressure in a volcano, ready to erupt with force that would reshape the landscape of their lives forever. And in the flickering emergency lighting of the Apex Combat Club, two men who'd spent months as predator and prey began to realize they were something far more complex, far more impossible. They were father and son, recognizing each other across 21 years of lies told in the name of love. The revelation was coming. And when it finally exploded into the light, it would leave everyone who witnessed it completely, utterly, devastatingly speechless. With truth too raw to be fabricated. Because Malcolm Ashford and Patricia Hawthorne told her they'd plant drugs in her apartment, frame her for crimes she didn't commit, make sure you grew up in foster care if she didn't disappear. Stop. David's roar echoed through the training facility, causing every conversation on the main floor to stop mid-sentence. The other club members turned toward the VIP lounge, sensing that something seismic was happening behind the frosted glass. But James couldn't stop. 21 years of searching, of desperate hope and crushing disappointment, came pouring out of him like a dam bursting. I held you for 3 hours after you were born, he continued, tears streaming down his scarred face. 3 hours before Rebecca's contractions started, and we had to rush to the hospital. You were so small, so perfect. You grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go, like you knew I was your father. David's breathing had become labored, his powerful chest rising and falling like he was drowning in air. You're lying. You have to be lying. The scar on your right knee, James pressed on relentlessly. Shaped like a crescent moon. You got it when you were 6 months old, fell off the changing table while I was trying to put on your diaper. Rebecca was furious with me for weeks. David's hand moved involuntarily to his right knee, where a small crescent-shaped scar was hidden beneath his work pants. A scar he'd had for as long as he could remember, a scar his mother had always said came from an accident when you were little. Stop, David whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. The way you sleep, James continued, his voice thick with desperate love. On your side with your left hand tucked under your cheek. You did that as a baby. Rebecca used to say you looked like an angel when you slept. Stop it. The way you move your hands when you're thinking deeply, you trace patterns in the air without realizing it. You got that from me. Rebecca used to tease me about it. Stop it. David's voice shattered into pieces, but James was beyond hearing, beyond stopping, 21 years of love and loss pouring out of him like blood from a severed artery. I named you, James whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying more impact than shouting. Rebecca wanted to call you Michael, but I fought for David. David means beloved in Hebrew. You were my beloved son before you took your first breath. The words hit David like lightning, illuminating memories he'd tried to bury. His mother in her final days, delirious from morphine and cancer, whispering words he'd thought were fever dreams. He wanted to call you David, said it meant beloved. He loved you so much, baby. Loved you more than his empire. David's legs gave out. He slid down the glass wall until he was sitting on the expensive marble floor, his powerful frame racked with sobs that came from a place deeper than pain, deeper than grief, from the very core of his being that had carried the wound of abandonment for 28 years. Daddy. The word slipped out broken, 8 years old, full of 28 years of longing and rage and desperate, impossible hope. James Sterling, billionaire, empire builder, apex predator of the business world, crumpled like a child. He fell to his knees beside his son, his massive hands reaching out with infinite tenderness to cup David's face. Yes, son, he whispered, his voice breaking on every word. It's me. It's Daddy. Can you imagine discovering your father after believing for 28 years that he abandoned you? How would you react to learning your entire life story was built on protective lies? Share your emotions in the comments. The dam burst completely. David collapsed forward into his father's arms, 28 years of carefully controlled strength dissolving into the desperate embrace of a child who'd finally found his way home. James wrapped his massive arms around his son, holding him with the fierce protectiveness of a man who'd lost everything and found it again. "I'm sorry," James sobbed into David's shoulder. "I'm so fucking sorry, son. I looked for you everywhere. Every day for 21 years. I never stopped looking." "She told me you didn't want us," David cried, his voice muffled against his father's chest. "She said you chose money over love." "I chose you over everything," James whispered fiercely. "I destroyed my relationship with my business partners looking for you. I spent billions on investigators. I would have burned my entire empire to ash if it meant finding you and your mother. But the way you treated me, the racism, the cruelty." James pulled back, his steel-gray eyes meeting his son's dark ones with horror and self-loathing that cut deeper than any knife. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice raw with anguish. "God help me, I didn't know it was you. I was so fucking angry, so broken by losing you both, that I became the monster Rebecca was protecting you from." The truth of it hit them both like a physical blow. James had spent 21 years becoming exactly the kind of man Rebecca had feared. Cruel, racist, using his power to hurt people who looked like the family he'd lost. And David had borne the brunt of that transformed cruelty, never knowing he was being punished for his own father's broken heart. "The irony is perfect," David laughed bitterly through his tears. "She saved me from you by making me the target of what you became." "I became a monster because I lost you," James said, his voice thick with recognition of the terrible symmetry. "And you suffered because I became a monster. Rebecca's greatest fear came true because she tried so hard to prevent it." They held each other in the amber emergency lighting, father and son reunited across 21 years of separation and pain, both broken by the same woman's desperate attempt to protect them from forces too powerful to fight directly on the main floor. The other club members pressed against the frosted glass, trying to understand what was happening in the VIP lounge. They could see shapes, hear voices, sense that something extraordinary was unfolding, but they couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. The racist billionaire who'd spent months tormenting a humble janitor had just discovered that his victim was the son he'd been searching for since before the young man was born. The abandoned child who'd spent 28 years hating a father he'd never met had just learned that every story he'd been told about his origins was a lie, crafted from love. And the woman who'd orchestrated it all, Rebecca Williams Washington, had died 5 years ago, taking to her grave the knowledge that her sacrifice had saved her son's life but destroyed both the men she'd loved most in the world. "She's gone," David whispered, the reality hitting him like a fresh wound. "She died thinking she'd saved me from you, never knowing that staying away from you was what put me in danger." "She did save you," James said fiercely, his hands still cradling his son's face like something precious and fragile. "She kept you alive long enough for us to find each other. That's all that matters now." "But the years we lost are gone," James interrupted, his voice carrying the strength that had built an empire. "But we have right now. We have this moment. We have the rest of our lives to make up for the time that was stolen from us." David stared into his father's eyes that were the same shape as his own, the same intensity, just a different color. For the first time in 28 years, he was looking at someone who shared his blood, his history, his genetic legacy. He was looking at home. "I don't know how to be your son," David admitted, his voice small and lost. "I don't know how to be your father," James replied with brutal honesty. "But we'll figure it out together. We have time now. All the time in the world." The emergency lighting flickered once more, then strengthened, as if the building itself was acknowledging that something fundamental had shifted in the universe. Two men who'd entered this space as enemies had been transformed into family, their reunion witnessed by shadows and amber light and the stunned silence of people who couldn't begin to understand what they'd observed. And as James Sterling held his son David Washington against his chest, both men realized that they were no longer the broken halves of Rebecca's heart. They were whole again. Finally, impossibly, devastatingly whole. The revelation had come. The truth had exploded into the light with the force of 21 years of compressed love and loss. And everyone who witnessed it, even from behind frosted glass, even without understanding the details, was left exactly as the title had promised. Completely, utterly, devastatingly speechless. Slipping away just hours after finding him. "You became a racist," David said quietly, each word measured and precise. "You became a bully. You became the kind of man who would humiliate a janitor for sport, who would treat a black man like property that occasionally needed replacing." I was broken. So was I. David exploded, surging to his feet with such violence that James instinctively stepped backward. So was my mother. But we didn't become monsters. We didn't start hurting innocent people because we were in pain. The truth of it hit James like a physical blow. He had become exactly what Rebecca had feared, a powerful white man who used his privilege as a weapon against people who looked like the family he'd lost. The irony was perfect and devastating. He'd spent 21 years becoming the monster his son needed protection from. "I'm sorry," James whispered, but the words felt pathetically inadequate. "Are you?" David's laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. "Are you really? Because 18 months ago, when you first started working me over, breaking me down, making me feel like less than human, were you sorry then? I didn't know it was you. Pretend that finding you fixes 28 years of damage. I can't pretend that knowing you searched for me erases 18 months of you systematically destroying my sense of worth." "Son, please." "I'm not your son," David said quietly, the words hitting James like bullets to the heart. "I'm the stranger you spent months teaching to hate himself. I'm the black man you couldn't be bothered to see as human until you discovered we shared DNA." James felt something inside him die. "That's not fair." "Fair." David's laugh was bitter, broken. "Fair would have been my mother telling you she was pregnant. Fair would have been growing up with a father. Fair would have been you recognizing my humanity before you discovered our biological connection." David stood up, his powerful frame radiating finality. "I need to go." "David, wait." "No." The word came out flat, emotionless. "I need to process this. I need to figure out who I am if everything I believed about my life was a lie. And I need to do it somewhere far away from you." "Please don't leave," James whispered, desperation bleeding through every word. "I just found you. I can't lose you again." David paused at the edge of the VIP area, his back to his father. When he spoke, his voice carried 28 years of pain that no revelation could instantly heal. "You lost me 28 years ago when you built an empire that was more important than love. You lost me 18 months ago when you decided a black janitor was suitable target practice for your rage. You lost me tonight when I realized that finding my father doesn't erase the damage he did to his son." He walked away without looking back, leaving James Sterling alone in the amberlit ruins of a reunion that had promised salvation but delivered only a more complex form of damnation. The main floor. The remaining club members watched in stunned silence as the janitor they'd all dismissed walked past them with the dignity of a king, while the billionaire they'd all feared sat broken and sobbing in a chair that had become his throne of isolation. No one understood what they'd witnessed, but everyone could feel the magnitude of what had been destroyed. A connection had been made and shattered in the same night, leaving wreckage too profound for words. James Sterling had found his son and lost him again in the space of 3 hours. And this time, the fault was entirely his own. The shatter point had been reached. The lowest emotional point of the story had arrived, and in the silence that followed David's departure, everyone who'd witnessed even a fragment of the night's events was left exactly as promised. "Final months. She asked me to call you if certain circumstances ever arose." David's heart stopped. What circumstances? "If James Sterling ever found you." The words hit like lightning in a dark room, illuminating corners David hadn't even known existed. "She told you about him?" "She told me everything, son. Everything. And she left something for you. Something she said you'd need if this day ever came." David's hands were shaking. What kind of something? Letters. Video recordings. The truth about what really happened 28 years ago. The truth she was too afraid to tell you while she was alive. I'll be right there. Dr. Hayes's office was in a medical building in Harlem that had seen better decades, but her warmth filled the space like sunlight. She was 70-something, with silver hair and knowing eyes that had witnessed decades of human pain and resilience. She loved you more than her own life, Dr. Hayes said gently, handing David a sealed manila envelope that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. But she loved him too. That's what made her choice so impossible. What choice? David read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. His mother, the woman he'd idolized, the hero of his personal mythology, had been lying about more than James's character. She'd been lying about her own motivations. She hadn't left to protect David from James. She'd left to protect herself from sharing him. The USB drive contained 47 video files, recorded during Rebecca's final months when the morphine made her honest about things she'd kept secret for decades. David watched them all, seeing his mother's face transform as she confessed truths that had eaten her alive for 28 years. I see him in you every day, baby. The way you move your hands when you think. The way you sleep with your face turned toward the light. You're so much like your daddy it breaks my heart. He's probably married now. Probably has other children. Children who got to grow up with the father I stole from you. Sometimes I dream about calling him, telling him where we are. But then I remember that sharing you would kill me, and I choose to be selfish one more day. I'm dying, and my greatest fear isn't death. It's that you'll find him after I'm gone and discover that your mother was a liar and a coward who chose her own happiness over yours. The final video was different. Rebecca was barely conscious, the cancer having ravaged her body until she was more ghost than woman. But her eyes were lucid, focused, desperate. David, baby, if you're watching this, it means James found you. It means my lies couldn't keep you apart forever. Her voice was barely a whisper. Don't hate him for what he became. Losing us broke him the same way lying to you broke me. We're all victims of my cowardice. But here's what I need you to know. Your father is a good man who made bad choices because of unbearable pain. Just like me. Just like you will someday. Love him, David. Love him the way I never let myself love him. Love him for both of us. And tell him Rebecca Williams never stopped loving James Sterling. Not for a single day. The video ended with his mother's eyes closing for the last time. David sat in the silence of Dr. Hayes's office, holding his father's engagement ring and feeling the weight of 28 years of lies, love, and sacrifice settling around him like snow. His mother had been wrong about almost everything. But she'd been right about one thing. James Sterling was a good man who'd made bad choices because of unbearable pain. Just like David had been doing for the past 3 days. Meanwhile, in his penthouse office, James Sterling was making a choice. That would define the rest of his life. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized, but never had the courage to use. Harrison? It's James. I need you to call an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow morning. Full attendance. James, it's almost midnight. What's this about? It's about telling the truth. Finally. What truth? James looked at the photograph of himself holding his newborn son, at the face that had haunted his dreams for 28 years. The truth about who I really am. And what I've become. And why it's time for me to choose love over fear. The choice was made. Tomorrow, James Sterling would walk into a boardroom and destroy his carefully constructed image to save the relationship that mattered most. And 30 blocks away, David Washington was holding his father's engagement ring and realizing that some choices were too important to make from pride or pain. Some choices had to be made from love. If you discovered your parent had lied to protect you but caused decades of pain in the process, could you forgive them? And could you forgive the other parent for becoming someone they never meant to be? Share your thoughts on forgiveness below. Both men were about to discover that the hardest choice wasn't between pride and vulnerability. It was between the past that had damaged them and the future they could build together. The choice was coming. And it would determine whether 28 years of separation ended in redemption or remained a tragedy too profound for healing. The Sterling Industries boardroom had witnessed countless moments of corporate warfare, but nothing in its mahogany-paneled history compared to what was about to unfold. 23 of Manhattan's most powerful individuals sat around the polished conference table at 8 a.m. sharp, their faces ranging from curious to annoyed at being summoned on such short notice. James Sterling stood at the head of the table, his massive frame carrying a different kind of presence than usual. Gone was the predatory confidence that had built an empire. In its place was something rawer, more vulnerable, a man who'd chosen truth over image, love over power. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice steady despite the earthquake he was about to trigger, 28 years ago, you forced me to make a choice between my empire and my family. I chose the empire. Today, I'm here to correct that mistake. Malcolm Ashford, now silver-haired but still radiating the same venomous entitlement, leaned forward with predatory interest. "James, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Rebecca Williams," James said quietly, and watched as recognition flickered across several faces. "The woman you threatened to destroy if I didn't abandon her. The woman who disappeared rather than watch you use our child as a weapon against me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Patricia Hawthorne, pharmaceutical heiress and architect of the original ultimatum, went pale as marble. "James," she said carefully, "that was a long time ago. Whatever you think happened, I know exactly what happened," James interrupted, his steel-gray eyes boring into each face around the table. "You gave me a choice. Her life or my empire. You told me you'd plant drugs in her apartment, frame her for crimes she didn't commit, make sure our child grew up in foster care if she didn't disappear. You're being dramatic, am I?" James smiled, but there was nothing warm about the expression. "Because I have recordings, Patricia. Digital files of every conversation, every threat, every piece of leverage you used to tear my family apart." The lie came easily, but the truth behind it was devastating enough. James didn't need recordings when he had 28 years of witnesses, paper trails, and the kind of evidence that could destroy empires. "What do you want, James?" Malcolm's voice had lost its confident edge. "I want you to understand what your threats cost." James pulled out his phone and displayed the hospital photograph, himself holding a newborn baby with a star-shaped birthmark. "This is my son, David. You never got to destroy him because his mother was smarter than all of us." "Where is he now?" Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For 28 years, he's been exactly where Rebecca hid him. Living in poverty while I built this empire. Working minimum wage jobs while I made billions searching for him. And for the past 18 months, James's voice cracked with emotion so raw that several board members shifted uncomfortably. "For the past 18 months, he's been working as a janitor at the Apex Combat Club, where I've been systematically humiliating him, breaking him down, treating him like property that occasionally needed replacing." The silence that followed was deafening. 23 of Manhattan's elites stared at James Sterling as the full implications of his confession sank in. "You've been torturing your own son," Malcolm whispered. "I've been torturing my own son," James confirmed, tears streaming down his scarred face. "Because your threats turned me into exactly the kind of monster Rebecca was protecting him from. Because losing them broke something inside me that I chose to let stay broken." "James, I'm not finished." James's voice carried the authority that had built an empire, but now it was powered by love instead of greed. "I'm dissolving my partnership with Sterling Industries. I'm liquidating my shares and using the proceeds to establish the Rebecca Williams Foundation, dedicated to supporting single mothers and their children." The boardroom erupted in chaos. Voices rose in protest, threats, desperate attempts to maintain control over assets worth billions. But James was beyond their reach now, protected by the armor of a man who'd finally chosen correctly. "You can't do this," Patricia snarled. "I can and I am," James replied calmly. "Because 28 years ago, you taught me that money was more important than love. Today, I'm proving you wrong." He walked toward the door, leaving behind the empire he'd built on the graves of his own happiness. But as his hand touched the handle, Malcolm's voice stopped him cold. "He'll never forgive you, James. Your son will never forgive what you've become." James turned back with a smile that held 28 years of hope and heartbreak. "Maybe not. But I'd rather spend the rest of my life earning his forgiveness than one more day being the man you turned me into." The boardroom door closed behind him with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing away the life James Sterling had built on compromise and cowardice. But as he walked toward the elevator, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Apex Combat Club. 1 hour. "It's time to finish what we started." David, the Apex Combat Club, felt different in the afternoon sunlight streaming through its floor-to-ceiling windows. Without the amber emergency lighting, without the forced intimacy of a lockdown, the space felt larger, more exposed, a stage set for whatever final act was about to unfold. James arrived first, his massive frame tense with anticipation and terror in equal measure. He'd traded his $1,000 suit for simple jeans and a t-shirt, looking more like the man Rebecca had fallen in love with than the billionaire monster he'd become. David emerged from the service elevator carrying a small velvet box, his powerful frame moving with that same impossible grace that had first caught James's attention months ago. But now, instead of hiding behind humble work clothes, he wore the confident bearing of a man who'd finally accepted his true identity. They stood facing each other across the training mats where their story had begun, predator and prey transformed into father and son, then torn apart by truth, now drawn back together by something stronger than pain. "I watched the videos," David said quietly, holding up the velvet box that contained his father's engagement ring. "All 47 of them." She lied about everything," David continued, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "About why she left, about your character, about her own motivations. Everything except one thing." "What's that?" "She loved you." David's voice cracked on the words. "She loved you so much that losing you drove her crazy. Just like losing us drove you crazy." James felt his legs threatening to give out. "Son, she made a choice based on fear," David said, stepping closer. "You made choices based on pain. I've been making choices based on anger. And all of us were wrong. I became a monster, you became broken," David corrected gently. "There's a difference. Monsters don't spend 28 years searching for their lost children. Monsters don't dissolve billion-dollar empires to prove their love is real." James stared at his son in amazement. "How did you know about the board meeting?" "Because I was there." David's smile was sad but genuine. In the service corridor, cleaning the conference room windows, "I heard every word." "You heard. I heard my father choose love over money. I heard him sacrifice everything to honor the memory of the woman who loved us both. I heard him become the man my mother always believed he could be." The words hit James like a physical blow, but this time the impact felt like healing instead of damage. "David, I'm so sorry, I know." David opened the velvet box, revealing an engagement ring that had waited 28 years to fulfill its purpose. "She wanted you to have this back. She said it belonged to the man who never stopped loving her." James stared at the ring, a simple band with a modest diamond that had cost him 2 months' salary when he was 26 and believed love could conquer anything. It looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. "I don't deserve it," James whispered. "Neither did she," David replied honestly. "She stole it when she left because she was selfish and afraid and human. Just like you. Just like me." David held out the ring, and James took it with trembling fingers. The weight of it felt like forgiveness, like redemption, like 28 years of separation finally coming to an end. "There's something else," David said, his voice growing stronger. "Something I need to tell you." "What?" "I quit my job at the club this morning. Effective immediately." James's heart sank. "David, you don't have to." "I quit," David continued with a smile that transformed his entire face, "because I got a better offer. Seems there's a new foundation that needs someone to run their martial arts programs for at-risk youth. Someone who understands what it's like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated like they don't matter." The realization hit James like lightning. "You want to work with me?" "I want to work with my father," David corrected, his voice carrying all the love that had been building between them since the moment they'd first locked eyes across these same mats. "I want to honor my mother's memory by being the man she raised me to be. And I want to give you the chance to be the father you always meant to be." James felt something inside his chest finally healing. Not the quick fix of recognition, but the slow, deep healing that came from forgiveness freely given and love finally chosen over fear. "Are you sure?" James asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "After everything I put you through, Dad," David said, and the word hit James like a benediction, like coming home after 28 years in exile. "You didn't put me through anything. You saved me." "How?" "By showing me what it looks like when a good man makes bad choices because of unbearable pain. By teaching me that healing is possible, even after decades of damage. By proving that love is stronger than hate, forgiveness more powerful than rage." David stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father, and James felt 28 years of searching finally come to an end. They held each other on the same mats where their story had begun in cruelty and competition, but now it was ending in love and forgiveness and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd been denied. "I love you, son," James whispered against David's shoulder, the words carrying 28 years of desperate hope finally given voice. "I love you too, Dad," David replied, and both men felt the weight of separation, lies, and pain finally lifting from their shoulders. They broke apart slowly, reluctantly, but their connection remained, no longer predator and prey, no longer strangers, no longer broken halves of the same heart. They were family. Finally, completely, unshakably family. "So," David said with a grin that carried echoes of the 8-year-old boy James had lost, "want to spar for fun? For real this time?" James laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd experienced in 28 years. "Just try not to embarrass your old man too badly." "No promises," David replied, settling into a fighting stance that spoke of joy instead of anger, connection instead of competition. They moved together on the mats where their story had begun, but now every strike was a conversation, every block an embrace, every combination a celebration of the bond that had survived lies, separation, and 28 years of enforced silence. And as they sparred, not as billionaire and janitor, not as predator and prey, but as father and son finally found, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to bless their reunion with golden approval. The story that had begun with a racist billionaire challenging a humble janitor had ended with a father and son choosing love over every force that had tried to keep them apart. The audience that had been promised something that would leave them speechless had witnessed exactly that. A reunion so powerful, so transformative, so absolutely perfect in its redemption that words felt inadequate to contain its beauty. James Sterling and David Washington had found their way home to each other. And everyone who witnessed their story, from beginning to end, was left exactly as promised. Completely, utterly, devastatingly speechless. But this time, it was speechlessness born of joy, of hope, of love triumphant against impossible odds. This time, the silence was perfect. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next. Click on the image or video showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.